All right, skipping along and still continuing the same thing. John is again asking Candy if she can see Jensen and what he has to say. Candy says, "I don't say anything. I just listen. He is telling us all the truth. I know it's true because of all those pictures they show us, and it was disgusting." John, "Who gave you the pictures?" Candy, "They didn't give them to us. They showed them on the screen. They were up there, all those black men with white women. It was revolting, disgusting. Those white women going after the black men. It's going to be a bad scene." John, "It's a bad situation, huh?" Candy, "It sure is. It's all true." John, "Is that what they're teaching in the organization?" Candy, "They show you." John, "Is that what the CIA, what Dr. Berger taught you?" Candy, "Marshall said that everybody knows a white who's going with a black. He said it is going to be some big problem. Marshall said that it is going to be tough on the children and that they should be sterilized. I think that's so." "And that's what Berger taught you?" Candy, "Uh-huh," becoming vehement. "They should be sterilized. They should not be allowed to bring in children. They should stick to their own kind. Does a tiger mate with a lion?" John, "Was that what Dr. Berger said?" Candy, "He sure did." John, "Is Dr. Berger paid by the CIA?" Candy, "He is the CIA. He's important out here in discussions, but I don't know how big he is." Okay, now, skipping from the control of Candy Jones and back to another book.
Well, in evaluating this, I think there are a couple of things. First of all, if the things we've presented so far haven't scared you, I would think that this would. Candy, at least according to this account, was not a bigoted individual, and yet was turned into a real hater, and a hater of a number of different people: Jews, Italians, blacks, all kinds of people. And I think it's worth taking note of in this context that, at least to a certain extent, I think, to the extent that the federal intelligence agencies, the U.S. government, is involved in programming people in this fashion, it represents, well, maybe the ultimate legacy of the Galen organization that we've talked about, where Nazi war criminals were brought into the country, incorporated into the intelligence system, and, well, they say big oaks from little acorns grow, and this would appear to be at least one of the trees that sprang up from that particular Nazi acorn. And it's worth noting here, too, note the stereotype and foul attitude towards black people, because the mental faculties of black people and the CIA and federal government's efforts to control black people and to effect mind control on them were a major focus of activity. And we're going to take a look now at some material indicating that a proposed center, which was going to be opened in Southern California during the Reagan administration, might have been used for effecting mind control on blacks. We're going to read you a section here from a book called The Mind Stealers, subtitled Psychosurgery and Mind Control. It's authored by a man named Samuel Chavkin, C-H-A-V-K-I-N. It's copyrighted 1978, published by Lawrence Hill and Company in softcover.
Okay, now bear in mind also that this area that we're talking about right now, that the author of The Mind Stealers is talking about a particular thing that was going on in the early 70s. However, that quite a bit of this is still going on. A lot of these things are still on the books. There are still people pushing for these kinds of control, and you know, this is not something that just because they're talking about the early 70s, something that's evaporated from the scene. As a matter of fact, Jack Anderson has printed a number of columns in the last couple of years about people in the Reagan administration talking about early screening for potential criminality in poor children and things like that, things that the current administration, that fringe elements thereof supposedly are pushing for. Anyway, once again, reading from Samuel Chavkin's The Mind Stealers. The development and acceptance of the idea of pinpointing those who may be potentially assaultive or crime-prone because of genetic, hormonal, or brain abnormality received major impetus during the Nixon administration. The Nixon General Staff was determined to sweep away the, quote, permissiveness of the 60s, in which social and economic factors took center stage as the prime causes of crime and disquiet. Their view, at least as publicly stated, was that there was ample opportunity for everyone to make it, socially and economically, and that those failing to do so had something intrinsically wrong with them. Quote, shape up or be zapped was to be the motto of the new generation. This was also the Nixon attitude when dealing with the civil protest disorders that continued to break out immediately before and after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Jr. It was in this climate of heightening demands for a better deal by the minorities, on the one hand, and the law and order frenzy, on the other, that 3 Harvard professors, Dr. Sweet, Dr. Mark, and Dr. Irvin, put forward the proposition that riots and civil disobedience may be sparked by individuals who unfortunately may be carriers of damaged brain cells. When under stress of such emotionally high-pitched confrontations as street demonstrations, these people will run amok, become assaultive, and precipitate acts of violence. The Harvard trio presented their view in a letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association, which appeared under the headline, quote, "Role of Brain Disease in Riots and Urban Violence." The letter, in part, follows.
The development and acceptance of the idea of pinpointing The poverty, unemployment, slum housing, and inadequate education underlie the nation's urban riots is well known. But the obviousness of these causes may have blinded us to the more subtle role of other possible factors, including brain dysfunction in the rioters who engaged in arson, sniping, and physical assault. It is important to realize that only a small number of the millions of slum dwellers have taken part in the riots, and that only a subfraction of these rioters have indulged in arson, sniping, and assault. Yet if slum conditions alone determined and initiated riots, why are the vast majority of slum dwellers able to resist the temptations of unrestrained violence? Is there something peculiar about the violent slum dweller that differentiates him from his peaceful neighbor? There is evidence from several sources that brain dysfunction related to a focal lesion plays a significant role in the violent and assaultive behavior of thoroughly studied patients. Individuals with electroencephalographic abnormalities in the temporal region have been found to have a much greater frequency of behavioral abnormalities, such as poor impulse control, assaultiveness, and psychosis, than is present in people with a normal brainwave pattern. These conclusions lead to a variety of questions. Is the activist just a violence-prone slum dweller? Is agitation for civil rights tantamount to impulsive pathological symptomatology? Is docility or acquiescence to slum conditions a sign of emotional health? Is this theory to serve as the scientific rationale to justify putting politically conscious ghetto protesters into the same category with muggers and murderers? And I'd like to repeat that last sentence and have you think about that in connection with Candy Jones and also some material we're going to present a little later. Is this theory to serve as the scientific rationale to justify putting politically conscious ghetto protesters into the same category with muggers and murderers? And still later, again reading from The Mind Stealers by Samuel Chavkin. Soon after their letter to the Journal of American Medical Association, Dr. Irvin and Dr. Mark published their book Violence and the Brain, which expanded their theory to include the possibility that there were as many as 10 million Americans wandering around the country who suffer from obvious brain disease, unquote, and an additional 5 million whose brains have been subtly damaged, unquote. They thus provided compelling data for the need to start a program for mass screening of Americans. Quote, "Our greatest danger no longer comes from famine or communicable diseases," they asserted. "Our greatest danger lies in ourselves and in our fellow humans. We need to develop an early warning test of limbic brain function to detect those humans who have a low threshold for impulsive violence. Violence is a public health problem, and the major thrust of any program dealing with violence must be toward its prevention." A couple of points here. The limbic system is a portion of the brain which controls primarily appetitive behaviors, hunger, sex, and so forth, and is connected with such things as violence. Also, the doctors referred to here, Dr. Vernon Mark, Dr. Frank Irvin, and Dr. William Sweet, all three of them Harvard professors and very obvious advocates of mind control.
Okay, now what Dr. Sweet and others were advocating very strongly in front of, among other things, Senate hearings, committee hearings on appropriations and other things, was the starting up and funding of diagnostic centers to sort out those people who might imperil society because of their brain abnormalities. One center that they were planning was being planned in Ronald Reagan's California at the time he was governor. Now, you'll remember earlier in the broadcast I made a passing comment about the fascinating return of coincidence that we see time and time again as we study these kinds of things, and how these people always seem to wind up in each other's hip pockets. You're going to hear a name mentioned in this next section of Dr. Louis Jolyon West. Dr. West, besides the things that we're going to talk about in this article, also just happened to be Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, and happened to be the man who argued on Ruby's behalf that Jack Ruby didn't really mean to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. He just happened to be in the Dallas police station with a gun, and then had a sudden attack of psychomotor epilepsy that forced him to pull the trigger, silencing the one man who might have been able to answer the questions about the John F. Kennedy assassination. So anyway, it was Lewis, Jolly, and West who was Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, and who basically was trying to get Jack Ruby off on the grounds that it was a total accident that he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, again, reading from the Mind Stealers, and they're talking again about these particular diagnostic centers. The Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence was to be set up to develop, quote, behavioral indicators, profiles, biological correlates to assist, quote, school administrators, law enforcement personnel, and governmental departments to detect and control, quote, overt expression of life-threatening behavior by identifiable individuals and groups. The proposed center was to be under the direction of the prestigious Neuropsychiatric Institute of the University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA, to those of you out there who like those initials, and it would be the prototype for other such facilities in different parts of the country. It was to be funded jointly by the state of California and the LEAA, which is the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, no longer in existence. For the first time in the history of the United States, criteria were to be set up for the labeling, or stigmatizing, it says in parentheses, of individuals believed to be potentially criminal, even though they had committed no crime. It was also astonishing that the program was so blatantly rigged against those sections of society that were the most vulnerable and least able to defend themselves. For those to be drawn upon for experimentation would be children, minority group members, and prisoners. Formation of the UCLA Center was announced in September 1972 by Dr. Lewis, Jolly, and West, director of the Neuropsychiatric Institute and chief architect of the overall plan. An affable, plumpish man in his early 50s, Dr. West is an adventurous psychiatrist who somehow appears in the headlines more often than most of his colleagues. Known as Jolly West, he came to considerable prominence as the very young director of the psychiatry department at the University of Oklahoma. It was there that he overdosed an elephant in the Oklahoma Zoo with LSD. Skipping down to the footnote, it says, there appears to be no connection between this zoo incident and the recent CIA revelations. At the time this book was written, they were talking about the revelations that the CIA had done LSD testing on human beings. But according to the New York Times of August 2, 1977, Dr. West was asked to make a study of LSD in relation to the CIA behavior control experiments. The New York Times reported that Dr. West was paid by the Geschichter Foundation, an organization allegedly used by the CIA to disperse funds to finance behavior research. So we find out, before we go back to the article itself, that before any of this had happened, that the man who was turned out to be Jack Ruby's psychiatrist had also been working for the CIA on behavior control modification. Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, hailed the Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence. He gave his official blessing in his January 1973 State of the State address. Reagan's Secretary of Health and Welfare quickly made known that, quote, more than $1 million would be invested in the center in the fiscal year 1973-74. Part of the subsidy was to come in the form of matching funds from the LEAA. As stated in Dr. West's original proposal, quote, a major thrust of the center's work will move into the largely unexplained interface between biological and psychological aspects of violent behavior, unquote, with the main lines of investigation focused on the genetic, biochemical, and neurophysiological factors.
And still later in Chapkin's book, the most frightening part of the proposal dealt with brain screening. In this connection, critics charged that Dr. West undoubtedly received a good deal of help from Dr. Irvin, who had moved from Harvard to Dr. West's Neuropsychiatric Institute at UCLA. The center prospectus listed Dr. Irvin as one of those who would be directly involved in the development of its program. In introducing this concept, Dr. West echoed the Mark Irvin theory by stating that, quote, approximately 5 to 10% of the population suffers from some impairment of brain function. The proportion is probably much higher among inmates of prisons and institutions for the criminally insane, unquote. He went on to say that, in some patients, outbursts of uncontrolled rage have definitely been linked to abnormal electrical activity in deeply buried areas of the brain. For many years, neurologists have measured the electrical activity of the brain with electrodes attached to the scalp. Now, by implanting tiny electrodes deep within the brain, electrical activity can be followed in areas that cannot be measured from the surface of the scalp," unquote. The future looked even more promising, Dr. West declared, and it is even possible to record bioelectrical changes in the brains of freely moving subjects through the use of remote monitoring techniques. Now, we're going to tell you a little bit more here about Dr. West and just what sort of a site he picked in order for his particular project.
Before Dave tells